thrust onto a campus where I was told that to be a progressive Zionist wasn't possible, that that was an oxymoronic position, because how could you possibly be a progressive and also believe in supporting, in their view, the last bastion of white colonialism in the Middle East? So that for me was an incredibly important formative time. My sophomore year of college was sort of a crucible for me in confronting people who didn't understand sort of the way I was raised and my view of the world, which is that it's possible to be many things. All of a sudden it was, you have to believe everything down this one particular lane, and if you don't, you're some kind of ideological traitor. And
or
that
if you
was
associate with people who have those different beliefs,
you're contaminated.
You're contaminated by those beliefs.
Yes.
That's a fascinating phrase, containing multitudes, because I think it's made you a lightning rod for the left and the right.
Yes.
That you're an equal opportunity object of hatred,
yes.
Not only in people's printed words, but on media, where people are far less restrained in the kind of critiques that they offer. Does that create for you a discomfort in who you are, or were you raised by these wonderful parents so securely that you go, they have their problems, I have mine, and we're all okay?
You know, I'm a sensitive people always say to me, you must have like the thickest skin.
I know, I said that.
Yeah, you said that. I don't. I'm a sensitive person, as anyone who knows me will attest. I think there's a few things I'll say. One, I am in this world and in the job that I'm doing, I love telling stories, and I love, journalism as a field is exciting and wonderful, and especially if you're someone who's curious about a lot of different things. But I'm in opinion journalism to promote a certain worldview and certain values that I have in the world. And that means that a lot of people are going to be angry about them if they don't agree. Part of the way that I judge if I'm doing a good job is the kind of enemies that I've earned for myself. And frankly, I feel like I've earned exactly the right enemies, at least in the past year and a half that I've been at the Times. So it's not that it's easy for me, although it has, I have to say, the more you do it, the easier it gets, and the more you resist looking at your Twitter mentions, the easier it gets. But I really look, there's a few people that I really admire, and I know if I get an email, in response to a particular column from basically a minion, basically one of 10 people that I really admire, that's enough for me. You might say it's my lodestar, or whatever that word in the anonymous op-ed was.
So let's drill down a little bit more on that, because your opposition to the president in terms of his personal character and many of his policies is well known, and yet you really wrote a very harsh column about Julia Salazar recently about how she presents herself in the world. And the idea that stories are powerful, but stories should somehow be based in some kind of objective reality, is open to question in our society right now. Because we tend to believe in the power of the story more than the worrying about where it came from. But why don't you tell us a little bit about your involvement with that story? Because I know it must have been challenging to write.
Yeah, so it wasn't challenging to write because I feel so passionate about how dangerous post-truth, like living in a post-truth era, is, not just for American democracy, but certainly for Jews. If you're living in I'll go back and I'll explain Julia Salazar.
Exactly.
I will.
Thank you.
But I want to say one thing about post-truth and the Jews, which is if you're living in an age in which there are no facts that we agree upon, but there's only narratives, then you're able to say the Holocaust is just a narrative. You're able to say the Jewish connection to the city of Jerusalem is just a narrative. Everything falls away in the face of that kind of postmodernism that's been long taken up by the far left, but now has an incredibly powerful voice in the form of the President of the United States. Mm-hmm. The Julia Salazar story, I see her obviously in a much, much, much more tiny and ineffective way, but similarly as sort of...
she is...
I'm doing it.
Okay, I'm sorry. I just wanted to die.
She is sort of a Trumpian figure in a mini way on the left. She is championed by the DSA, the Democratic Socialists of America, who are really rising in power, and they're a fairly far-left group. They are incredibly powerful in Brooklyn, where they helped elect her to state senate. She framed herself and ran her campaign in a very identity politics focused way. She presented to people as if she was a Jew of color, that she was from a working class background, that she was raised by a single parent, that she was not born in the United States, and that she was an immigrant. All of the things that right now carry a tremendous amount of weight if you want to run on the left in terms of identity. None of them turned out to be true. And it was really just sort of this bundle of lies. And yet, one of the things that alarmed me about it is that her supporters, there was no bridge that she couldn't cross that would lose her support. And in fact, she ended up winning the election. And basically, the logic was the ends justify the means. And I saw in this small case a mirror image of what had happened on the right with Trump. Obviously, not as powerful, a much smaller stage, but it scared me the way that I saw the way that I see the right ring fencing around him and saying, you know, nothing really matters as long as he's doing the things that we want. I saw that same thing happening on the left, and that really disturbed me. And so I wrote a piece about it.
Right, and you also got a lot of critique from people who said precisely those things. Don't you understand what good she's going to do? She's going to, you know, really upset the logjam in Albany and things like that. And the fact that they wanted her to, that she's a template for what they hoped her agenda would be.
You hear that on the, you know, on the right among Zionists that support Trump. Mm-hmm. We have to support him because he's going to scuttle the Iran deal, because he's going to move the embassy, because he's going to do any number of he's going to enact any number of policies that will be good for us. And It's true, those specific policies may be good for the Jews or for Israel, but in my view, the stakes of accepting that, the bargain, is absolutely not worth it.
And for me, who goes to Israel at least twice a year, I'm telling you, Trump is revered in Israel. There are street banners on light posts exalting him. They're already naming squares for him in the public sphere. And so when I say that I have real problems with not the result of the embassy being in Jerusalem, but the process by which it was not part of any larger set of discussions, negotiations, or outcomes, people look at me like I'm crazy because they say, don't you understand? We got the embassy in Jerusalem.
Right.
Right?
Yes, and it's a difficult position for those of us who are happy with some of Trump's policies. Mm-hmm. But the question is, on the whole, is the trade worth it? And to me, it's absolutely not. To me, the idea of having a post-truth president who is, I mean, I've said this so many times before, but a post-truth president who is degrading the civil fabric of our society so rapidly in a way that I think could lead to violence is just absolutely not worth it.
Well, and just the other day, he praised the congressman who threw Giafforte, the reporter, to the ground up in the upper Northwest, as saying that that's what we should be doing with our opponents. And then you get the Proud Boys, who almost rioted in front of, what was it, the Republican Club in New York last week.
There was a physical
confrontation.
Fight. I mean, the Proud Boys are a gang.
Yes.
I mean, they're a gang. People are hesitant to call them that because they don't look like a Mexican gang or a black gang or gangs that people might be used to. But the Proud Boys are an alt-right gang.
Everybody understands the Proud Boys are in the news, and they espouse a white supremacist, far alt-right position, and they're willing to commit acts of physical confrontation to achieve their end, which is to get a higher public profile for their views. Would that be a fair statement?
Yes. There was a profile written about Gavin McInnes, who is the head of the Proud Boys, in the Times the other day that I would recommend to people. But also you see it on the left, right? You saw Mitch McConnell in a restaurant the other night, you know, surrounded by people. You have Sarah Huckabee Sanders. Like, this is not a coincidence that all of this is happening right now while Trump is president.
Right. So that the inability to maintain civil conduct on the right and the left is kind of a result of the doors to that behavior that were opened.
Right. There are no guardrails right now.
Right.
And there are no sort of adults running, it feels, at least to me, like there are no adults in the room running the country. And the result of that is a very terrifying dehumanization of the other side that I think is already leading to a kind of public shaming and humiliation of people that don't agree with you, and has already led to violence.
I think this leads into another area that I wanted to talk to you about, because in May you wrote about something called the IDW. You talked about the intellectual dark web, which I had kind of heard of vaguely but never really read about. Anytime I see the dark web on TV, I go, I'll watch the weather, because it's, the dark web is a terrifying concept of, it truly is the Wild West where anything goes. And the notion of an intellectual dark web where people can really sling ideas at the extremes to each other seems to be equally frightening for somebody who has spent his entire career doing civil discourse, behind-the-scenes dialogues between opponents and things like that. Could you tell us a little bit about this IDW phenomenon, the intellectual dark web?
I absolutely will. And first I'll start by saying what they're not. They're not people at the political extremes at all. What is unique about them, let me back up a step. We live in a sort of paradoxical era in which everything seemingly can be said, at least in the political realm. We have a president who talks about grabbing women by the pussy. We have people running for office who are openly anti-Semitic. I know that's never been said on stage here. That's why I had to do it.
That is the first time that word has ever been said from this pulpit. I just want you to know.
Hi, Grandpa. So, on the one hand, we live in the most obscene era. And yet, on the other hand, and this is the weird paradox that we're living in elite intellectual media culture, academic culture, you might even find this in your own lives, there is a vanishingly small, the Overton window, the things that are permissible to be said is increasingly narrow. So for example, if you want to say at a dinner party in Brooklyn right now, I don't think gender is a social construct, you will be pilloried as someone who denies the rights of transgender people, who is a bigot in some way, and I could go on and on and on. With the intellectual dark web, and the name is a bit of a joke, I mean, it's sort of a wink and a nod to the idea that the ideas that they're talking about not 5 years ago would be thought of as incredibly commonsensical and non-controversial, but they've been drubbed out of major, first of all, universities, but also certainly the press. I mean, there are things that I cannot say in my office that I would be more comfortable saying in this room, and we can get to that in a minute. So the intellectual dark web is a group, an informal group of there's a lot of evolutionary biologists in it. There's some media personalities, other intellectuals. If you've heard of Sam Harris, the famous atheist, he's a major figure in the movement. And there are others. And what they're basically saying is, enough with the identity politics, enough with dehumanizing people that are 5 feet to the left of us or 5 feet to the right of us politically. We want to have a real conversation. And what has been absolutely fascinating about them as a phenomenon is that they are easily selling out 10,000-person stadiums in cities like London, where two people will sit on stage for 3 hours and talk about the nature of free will.
We're not going 3 hours.
We're not. And I would really love for people to read, you could just Google Bari Weiss intellectual dark web. What I find inspiring about them is cable news basically assumes that people are stupid, that people only want to hear about subjects. First of all, basically between 5 and 10 subjects are interesting on cable news, and that every conversation should be contained in 6 to 8 minute blocks with 4 talking heads screaming at you. What the intellectual dark web is saying is people are really smart, and people are really hungry to talk about interesting, engaging intellectual things. I'll end with this. The other way that you can see the power of this phenomenon is in podcasting. They are taking incredible advantage of the fact that you can't read a book while you do your laundry or while you drive your car or do other things, but you can listen to podcasts, and audiobooks, which means that people have hours of recovered time in their day. And they're taking advantage of that to have incredibly sophisticated, interesting conversations. The #1 most popular podcast in the country is hosted by an MMA, a mixed martial arts commentator named Joe Rogan, who happens to have a lot of these people on his podcast. When Elon Musk wanted to make news the other day, he didn't go to 60 Minutes. He went on Joe Rogan and talked for 3 hours, and they got 20 million views in 2 days. So it's sort of this alternative, think about it as there's the mainstream media, and then there's this alternative media network that is very Wild West, free largely, and is being run by these sort of renegade professors and intellectuals and media personalities. And I think the mainstream media ignores the power of what they're doing at their peril.
So to ask the obvious follow-up question, would you recommend to us as thoughtful, engaged people that we listen to these podcasts, that we explore that deep, not dark web, but the deep exploration of these ideas as part of how we inform ourselves as to who we are in the world, who we are as Jews, who we are as informed citizens?
Yeah, I mean, like anything.
Because I'm scared.
Right, don't be scared. So think about MSNBC, right?
Yes.
There are shows that are really worth watching on MSNBC, and there are shows that just aren't. It's the same thing in this network. There are people and aspects of it that are not blue chip, let's say,
Sure.
and there are those that are. If people are really curious, I would recommend starting with by following Maajid Nawaz on Twitter. Maajid Nawaz is a former Islamist who was jailed in Egypt, who is now a Muslim reformer, who's a very powerful force in this movement. And I would download Sam Harris's podcast. It's called Waking Up. I think it's very provocative. He is a staunch atheist and was sort of that before he was a convener of this group. But I think that the guests he has on will be absolutely fascinating to anyone in this room.
But what's also interesting to me is that I'm a 4-decade supporter of the Southern Poverty Law Center. Mm-hmm. And to have them come out and brand Ayaan Ali Hirsch as a promoter of hatred.
Ayaan Hirsi Ali.
Excuse me?
Ayaan Hirsi Ali.
Yes.
Yes.
Is challenging because, of course, I'm against hate, and I give my resources to do that. I've heard her speak on the television. But if anybody who disagrees with us is a promoter of hate, then there can be no discussion.
Right. So there's this very dangerous thing happening, which I think of as concept creep, which is, what is hate? Mm-hmm. Is hate saying, I was born in Somalia, and I had my clitoris cut out when I was a child, and then I escaped child marriage.
First time for that one too. Yeah.
And ran away to the West.
Right.
And became a champion of free speech and civil liberties and lived my life under armed guard. And guess what? I have some beef with Islam. And maybe I say things that go over the line a few times. Are we going to call that person
Yeah, exactly.
a hate monger or not? The Southern Poverty Law Center has, in my view, lost its way in the same way that the ACLU has, which is that groups that had a very specific mission have now sort of given themselves over broadly, and sort of from an emotional perspective, I understand it. You have this unprecedented president, right? And so now they've given themselves over in any way to sort of joining the resistance. But in doing so, they don't realize that they are betraying fundamental values that I think that they hold. You see this also, frankly, in the Me Too debate, right? What is sexual harassment? Is it touching your knee? Is it saying something to hit on someone else? I mean, these things have gotten, this is the concept creep problem, right? They've gotten stretched beyond, I think, what most reasonable people would think the definition is. I had a debate with someone the other day where we were talking about rape. And the person said to me, it's possible that someone could feel that they were raped. Okay, think about that for a second. That is a wildly different understanding of what most commonsensical people think about as being rape. So that's sort of where there's this trend that's happening on the left in terms of broadening the definitions of these things, which is coming from a place maybe of wanting to promote justice, but I think is quite dangerous.
But it's really hearkening back to what you said before, that the intensity of feeling has replaced the clarity of fact.
Yes.
And I think that's very dangerous. It's dangerous for Jews, by the way. I want to explore a little bit what you opened the door to do, which was the gender issue. In today's New York Times, it said that Trump's administration is trying to roll back the very definition of trans. It's trying to eliminate it from the federal vocabulary, which even if there are biologists who talk about that movement going too far, I think that transgender is pretty much a planted concept in American social and intellectual consciousness. So it is challenging to me to have people who tell me I'm LGBTQ, I'm trans, this is who I am, this is who I know I am, and then whether I have any questions about who they are as a person and I need to hear their story, What I do have to do is defend them against the federal government, who wants to either disenfranchise them or simply ignore them or disqualify them as individuals in their unique identity. Would you agree with the Trump position that was just set out? It was just in today's Times.
I didn't read today's Times because I came
you're
right
with
here.
family, for goodness sake. It's okay.
I could say a few things about this, which is I always err on the side of respecting
the individual.
the individual.
Right.
And I think that's deeply American. And if someone says to me, I want to be called, I don't care what you look like. You know, let's say you're presenting as a total, as a man, and you tell me I want to be called by female pronouns, I'm going to do that just because, obviously, if you're going out of your way to request that of me,
it's important.
It's important to you, and it's going to make your life slightly easier, and life's already too hard as it is. That said, I think that the debate about the transgender issue is quite, I want to be careful with what I say here, is very, very fraught. Meaning, I have a feeling that the way that the trans community is in a weird way reifying the gender binary, which is to say, I don't feel like a woman, so I'm going to get surgery so that so that my
body dysphoria, yes.
Yeah, that in a weird way it's limiting the idea of what it is to be a woman in the world, which is a feminist critique of where the transgender debate is right now. That's something that I feel like is quite hard to say in a conversation these days.
Let me just focus it back into what I would say are more the Me Too issue.
Okay.
That I think a lot of us can relate to, because there are many women here who have stories that we literally could not compile. There are so many of them of either being harassed or ridiculed or commented upon or on and on and on. And it's really had a profound effect on how we look at just communicating with each other. And then you wrote a column about Ansari that said bad dates should not be criminalized. I'm paraphrasing, of course, that you got hammered for. Does everybody know the Aziz Ansari case? I see a lot of head nods. Can you give a little background and why you wrote what you did, and maybe we share some of the reaction to it?
Sure. So Aziz Ansari, and I just want to go back. I feel like I don't have a sophisticated answer to the trans question because I don't know the policy that we're talking about.
So don't worry about it. We'll all look it up later.
Okay. But the reason, I want to focus on this for a second. The reason that I'm apologizing and feeling the need to be extremely careful is that we're living in an age right now where any errant thing that someone says, especially a public person that comments on politics, can be ripped from context.
And weaponized.
Right. Against you. Right. So, a misstatement that I just made 5 seconds ago could go out on Twitter and make it seem as though I'm someone who doesn't support people that are transgender.
Right.
So that is the kind of reality that I'm living in, which is very hard because my job is to think and speak freely, and yet that very ability to think and speak freely can be turned against me at any moment on social media. So that's just something I'm incredibly aware of, and that is why I feel the need to apologize. It's not because I didn't read the Times or I don't know about the policy. Okay, Aziz Ansari. Aziz Ansari is an actor. He's a stand-up comic. He's in this show called Master of None on Netflix. He went on a date with a woman who he met at like an Oscars or Emmys after party. They went out, they had dinner, they went back to his apartment. Because we're on the Bima and I've already said 2 inappropriate things, I will let you look up the details of what happened on their date. But it was a bad date. It was a bad hookup by any normal standard. It sounded like he was insensitive, and that it was just not the best night of this woman's life. Then, sort of at the height of the Me Too debate, a very small website, which I had not heard of beforehand, called babe.net, published an anonymous account of this date that happened between these 2 people. And it was a very long piece, and it basically suggested that he was guilty of some kind of sexual misconduct or even sexual assault because, and this was the phrase that really stuck out to me, because he didn't pick up on the woman's nonverbal cues. Now, as a woman, I know when people are not picking up on my nonverbal cues. That's a real thing. But to hold someone accountable for not being able to read your mind and then go on to publicly shame them for it, to me seemed like a bridge too far. And so I wrote the piece, and the headline of the piece was Aziz Ansari is guilty of not being a mind reader, because that should not be our expectation. And the argument that I was trying to make in the piece is, I am a very strong feminist. A huge part of what I feel is, being a feminist in the world is saying what you mean and saying what you want and not allowing other people to sort of act on you as if you're a passive person in the world. And the sort of implicit argument in her piece was, this happened to me and I was a victim, and my argument back to her was, it's hard to say something, but we need to be empowering women in those awkward moments that we've now heard, thousands of each of us. I've heard hundreds of stories from people I know this year, to say, I don't like this. I'm getting up and I'm walking out the door, and I don't care if you're someone I had a crush on, or if you're a celebrity, if you're someone I thought I could get a job from. Get up and walk out the door. And that's what this piece was about. In my mind, it was making a very commonsensical, sort of fundamentally feminist argument, but a lot of people felt otherwise.
I'm just going to leapfrog from that into another area. That it came out this week that there has been a dramatic drop in fertility in the United States, and Paul Ryan famously said, well, I did my job. I had 3 kids. Everybody needs to get busy and have more children because we can't sustain our country. And then the further commentary was, well, this is a result of the Me Too movement. This is a result of the shaming of men. This is the result. And
I did not see that. That's crazy.
I'm sorry, I read sources that you don't. You read sources that I don't, and I read sources that you don't. But the idea that somehow masculinity itself is been so under assault that we can't even reproduce as a country or as a species or whatever. I'm getting the sense that you would reject that argument out of hand.
Yes. I also think, I think the drop in fertility, at least in the circles that I'm traveling in, have to do with the fact that women have more choice and more power than they've had in human history. And they're waiting longer to have
Absolutely.
kids, and partly that means they're having less kids.
Right.
There is a very fascinating obsession with gender and masculinity right now going on in our culture that I'm totally fascinated by, and I don't quite understand. I think part of it is that in a way we have this president who, is an idiot's idea of what a man is. He's the most fake masculine person you could ever imagine. It's all bluster. There's nothing real. There's no real underlying virtues that we think of as being manly.
Right.
Anyway. But yeah, I agree that there's an obsession right now with masculinity being under siege with men. There's all of these clinics now that are focused on men's sperm counts being lower, and I don't quite totally understand what it's about. But I agree with you that it's there. The idea that Me Too is leading to people having less kids is the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard.
Good. I'm glad that we agree. Later, at the end, I'm going to tell you the one thing I know we disagree about, but then we're going to save that for later. Let's get Jewish. We're on the pulpit of a sanctuary here. There are people who say to me, because of the alt-right, because of Charlottesville, because Jews will not rule us, and the signs and things like that, and the acceptance by some as swastika as part of political discourse, that Jews are in danger in this country. Now I'm going to famously quote the famous maxim of Jonathan Sarna, professor of history, Jewish history at Brandeis, who said that the Jewish people is a people that never fails to see the dark at the end of the tunnel. Right?
Yes.
And people are making active comparisons to Germany, whose anti-Semitism has such deep roots in religion, faith, and history, not just faith, but in religion, politics, and history. Do you fear for the rise of far-right anti-Semitism? Then we'll ask about far-left.
I think if you're a student of Jewish history, you have to be aware that anything is possible.
Okay.
I'm going to bundle in the far-left thing because I want to.
Sure.
Which is, What is scary to me is that there's two caste systems developing in this country at the same time. The one on the far right has white males, non-Jews, at the top, and insists that they're the only heirs to America and
Americanism
and Western civilization. Right. And the Jews, in their view, are at the bottom. Then you have the caste system that's developing on the left, in which the more claims you have to victimhood, right, the higher you are in that caste system. Jews, by virtue of our incredible success in this country, also have no place in that caste system. So we're getting squeezed on both sides in the same exact moment. Right. So we are sort of we're in this like politically homeless territory, which again is why I think that the identity politics issue should be a priority for Jews because of this caste system that I'm describing. Could something happen here? I mean, that's what you're asking. Should we be scared of it?
Something. Once you get past Philip Roth's sexual challenges that he wrote about so prolifically, The Plot Against America, if you ever read it, is an astonishing book, well footnoted, about how things could turn south here. And it was the first time I took that argument seriously, because what I said is historic charges of deicide, killing Jesus, this has never really been part of American discourse. Even in the Civil War, when General Grant ordered Jewish merchants off of the battlefield, called General Order Number 11, General Halleck revoked that order the moment he heard about it because he said, you cannot treat people as a class. So we don't have the deeply historic roots here, but what we do have, and that I think you're alluding to, is that political spectrums, or spectra, are not linear, they're circular, and the extremes of the left do equal the extremes of the right in terms of the tactics they're willing to employ, and both of them will employ Jew hatred for one reason or another. Would you agree or no?
Yes, and that made me think of something else, which is that when conspiracy-minded thinking comes to dominate a culture's politics, that is very, very dangerous for us, because anti-Semitism is not just a prejudice, it's a conspiracy theory.
Right.
It's a conspiracy theory that says there's a secret hand that controls the world, and that secret hand, in the answer, in the anti-Semitic conspiracy theory, is the Jew. I think one of the reasons, even though I don't think Trump is at all an anti-Semite in his heart, the reason that I think that anti-Semites are drawn to Trump's banner is precisely because of that sort of globalist, secret hand controlling the world, conspiracy-minded thinking. So that is very concerning to me. I think that we as Jews, because of our history and because anti-Semitism has almost exclusively, historically, not always, but largely come from the right, we are very attuned to that. When we see Charlottesville, we know, like in our guts, what that's about.
The swastika's pretty evident,
yes.
Right? Yeah.
I think one of the things that's harder is for us to recognize anti-Semitism on the left. I think that has to do with the fact that those are the circles we largely travel in. A lot of those people are our friends, and it's wrapped up in language that, frankly, we want to be a part of. Universalism, social justice, all of these things that we pride ourselves on are being used in a way as weapons against us. I think the thing Jews have to get smarter about in this country, we know when things on the right go too far. We know that very, very viscerally. I don't think we have the same sensitivity when it comes to the left, and I think we need to develop that instinct for danger there.
Let's shift to Israel. About 10 years ago, Israel bypassed America as the place with the largest Jewish population in the world. And so, in some sense, Israel is its own Jewish phenomena, and there is a widening gulf, of course, between American Jews, especially younger American Jews, and Israel, as Israel sees itself, as it sees itself in its region, not just in the country, and as how it sees itself in the world. So, a classic formulation of this is, well, Israel is powerful in its country and is oppressing a minority called the Palestinians. Israelis would say, we're a minority in a region that stretches from Morocco. You okay, kiddo?
Yeah. I'm totally fine. No, go on.
To Iran, to Malaysia, where the prime minister who was just reelected after many years of being out of office has reaffirmed that Jews are a problem and they have hooked noses. I mean, he basically said this in one of his speeches recently. So how do we navigate this, especially when in the West, the activism of people who oppose Israeli government policies gets drawn to BDS, to boycott, divest, and sanction? Can you, as, excuse me, I'm going to quote your own words, as an unhinged Zionist, I'm a hinged Zionist. It doesn't.
It was a joke, Jeremy.
I know. It doesn't hinge on anything, but I am certainly there a lot, and I believe in Israel as a country, as an idea, and I truly believe that Zionism is the national liberation movement of the Jewish people. I believe that ever since its inception. But we have this case of Laura Al-Qassam, who just, I think that's how you pronounce her name, who, instead of simply going back home after she was denied entry into Israel to study at Hebrew University, remained there, and the Supreme Court just affirmed her right to stay for a year and study. And according to what I read in commentaries, your and Bret Stephens' column, as unhinged Zionists, supporting her ability and right to stay there was a factor in the actual Israeli debate. So you're right in the middle of this, whether you like it or not. So what is your feeling about how Israel should respond to the BDS phenomenon, either there in the region or here? What should Israel do to foster a closer relationship with an entire generation of American Jews that either see it as irrelevant or antagonistic?
Okay, so there's a few parts of this question.
Just parse it, please. Thank you.
Let's start with the beginning, which is the division issue. I think the Jewish world is largely divided into those who see the Jewish people and Israel as either a David or as a Goliath.
Sure.
I think both are false.
Right.
Both are true. And the voices that I see as wise, people like Yossi Klein Halevi and Mati Friedman, are people who are able to see both truths at once and to contain that inside of themselves and to decide in each given case, do I need to criticize Israel from which side here, or do I need to love it publicly? And I think that the concern that I have is not just America and Israel division. It's the cleaving between those who see Israel fundamentally as a victim and those who see it fundamentally as a victimizer. It is true that Israel in the world is the Jew among the nations still, as you laid out. It's also true that for millions of Palestinians, Israel, and not to mention Hamas, are its victimizers. And we have to contend with that reality. Bret Stephens, who you mentioned before, has this amazing line, which I will steal and credit to him, which is, Israel did not come into being to showcase Jewish victimhood and Jewish suffering. And we should be proud of the fact that we have power and strength. But with power and strength comes responsibility.
Sure.
And I think it's very important to contend with that. So that's one answer.
Okay.
Laura Al-Qassam in BDS. I don't know if you guys read this column, but basically what has happened is that because of this strategic affairs ministry, which is basically a part of the government in search of a mission in Israel, from what I understand, they waste millions of shekels on.
Kind of like the Jewish Agency.
Okay. They have taken on this policy of stopping people that support or have perceived to support the BDS movement, the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement at the border with Israel. This sort of reached a nadir 2 weeks ago when a young woman of Palestinian descent from Florida came to Israel to study, to get a master's at Hebrew U, was stopped at the airport, and rather than just turning around, said, no, I'm waiting here until you let me in. She came with a visa from the Israeli embassy of Florida. For 2 weeks she sat there, and I saw this story and I said, I really try and choose my battles strategically in terms of when I criticize Israel publicly. Privately is a different story, but publicly, when there are so many people in the world constantly attacking Israel, I want to be very careful about when I decide to criticize it, and to be very clear that that criticism is coming from a place of love. I felt it would be especially powerful, given my reputation as a Zionist and Bret's, if we wrote this piece together. And so we ended up writing a piece making both the case in terms of principle and pragmatism of why she should be allowed into the country. The principled reason is that Israel rightly prides itself on being a democracy and an exponent of Western values in a region that really, really needs it.
Sure.
Keeping people in an airport for crimes of the mind is not in keeping with being a liberal democracy. Then there's the pragmatic reason, which made, I think, our argument appeal to a lot of people on the right, which is it telegraphs a great weakness about a culture if you're saying that we're scared of letting a 22-year-old into our country. It telegraphs incredible strength if you say, we have nothing to hide. Everyone here is welcome to see what the state of Israel is all about. And in fact, if you, like Laura Al-Qassam, are someone who previously supported BDS, but yet want to come study in Hebrew University in Israel, by all means, we're opening our gates to you. Mm-hmm. So we wrote the piece and got a lot of attacks from the right, which, it depends on the day where I'm getting attacked from. But from what I understand from very high-placed Israeli sources, that piece made an enormous difference in actually allowing this woman into the country. But I hope more broadly, having Israel reflect on itself. Does it really want to be making a martyr of 15 people a year that come in as, even if they, let's say, they are supporters of BDS? Is it a strategic decision to make these people into martyrs? Because that's what Israel's doing. And this dominated a news cycle for 2 weeks. Is that really what Israel wants in the press?
Well, I think you were here on Rosh Hashanah morning. I actually spoke about Peter Beinart being stopped at the airport. I spoke about people who want to look at different points of view being told that you might not be ideologically pure enough to even enter the country on your tourist visa, which is just so challenging. It's not the Israel I know and love and go and study in. It really isn't. At the same time, just turning the coin over, at my beloved alma mater, the University of Michigan, there was a young woman who wanted to do study abroad internship, and her professor, once he found out that she was going to Israel, nixed the whole thing.
It's happened twice, actually.
Right.
Yeah.
So
we have another Michigan alum right
BDS
here.
is not just about economics. BDS is about culture. It's about academia. It's about intellectual freedom of thought. It's about all of these things, and I take the BDS threat very, very seriously.
So do I, and that's why I don't want Israel imitating it by keeping people like that stuck in an airport. I think it's the worst possible look. BDS is an enormously important challenge. When you talk about, American Jews, young American Jews being seduced by it, I have to say, I look to the older people in the room and say, what have you taught the younger generation? Like, the idea that...
Yeah, guilt is the gift that keeps on giving, just so you know.
Like, I was having a conversation with someone the other day, and they were like, my kid, they're 20 years old, they don't know, all they know is Israel's the oppressor. I'm like, I'm sorry. It's your job to teach them about 2,000 years of Jewish history and explain to them that being alive during the return to Jewish political sovereignty is a miracle beyond anything that happened in the Bible. Really. Like, I really believe that. And if you don't get that and you haven't taught your child that and all they know from Israel is like Natalie Portman protesting an award or whatever, that's on you.
Right.
And I really think that, if that's the case, then the Jewish community needs to really be looking at its funding priorities and figure out how to solve that problem.
Well, every time the Israeli government has, either under the guise of strategic affairs or hasbara, which literally means explanation but comes off as propaganda, they do it badly. And one of the things that we find is that Israelis who come here don't know us, don't know our lives. And again, this very congregation, as a Reformed congregation, is seen as either suspect or illegitimate by mainstream Israelis. What was interesting is in just last week, they published a study in Israel that said that the number of people who identify with Reform or Conservative Judaism
is growing.
Went from 6 to 7% to 12 to 14% in less than 10 years. Mm-hmm. And so that may reflect Israeli Jews' desires to be as disconnected as many American Reform Jews are. What am I teaching our people here? Guilt on me, right? But I think that Israel is really reaching a point now between the number of Haredi Jews,
Yeah.
who is going to surpass 1 million in the next year, which is more than 18% of the population, the religious Zionist movement, and the people who say to the religious part of the government, get out of my life, get out of my food, get out of my weddings, that those tensions are only going up. And it's very hard for them to even care about us, much less relate to us in our struggles here as we're trying to strengthen an American progressive Judaism. And I would say all non-Orthodox Judaisms are progressive in their own way, but it's really, really hard.
I think part of it comes, though, from, like, the answer to that question lies in our history and our texts.
Sure.
If we put the value of Klal Yisrael and loving other Jews at the center of our Judaism, it paves the way for a lot of good things can come from that. One of the things that I feel is so special about the Jewish community in Pittsburgh is that sense of we are all one Jewish community. And I have to say, shocked when I went to school at Columbia, and it was like, not only do you have to choose your Reform, your Conservative, your Orthodox, but are you the kind of Orthodox where you wear this level heel to Shabbat services, or do you wear the Manolo Blahniks, or do you wear the... Like,
oh my gosh.
I mean, so it was so...
I'd rather wear a tie every day. Oh, okay.
It was just knowing that it allowed me to approach all of it and to approach my Zionist activism from a really grounded place, feeling like the core Jewish values that were driving me are less about the height of a mechitza, frankly, and more about how am I serving in the link of this chain of Jewish history? And am I doing my part to make it continue and make it strong and make it better? As you know, I'm extremely passionate about egalitarian Judaism. I am very, very supportive of Women of the Wall and other like-minded groups in Israel that are promoting reform and conservative and what I just think of as egalitarian Judaism. I think part of our job is to, rather than saying, okay, the Haredi population's going up, okay, there's nothing we can do about that.
Sure.
What can we do? We can make heroes out of people like Susan Silverman. We can make heroes out of, we can bring people like that to a shul like this. There are lots of things we can do. I hear a lot about like this demographic crisis. I don't really think people having babies is a crisis or not having babies is a crisis. I'd rather think about who are the people that are reflecting our values there and how can we connect with them and hold them up. And that's one of the most exciting parts of my work, frankly. What you guys see is 20% of what I do in a day. A huge part of my job is commissioning new voices. So the reason you see people like Mati Friedman in the New York Times is because I'm his editor and I'm working with him. Or when you see Yossi, or when you see any number of people, a young Iranian chess player who left Iran and was forced off of the national team because she refused to cover her hair. We had a giant piece from her in the New York Times because I read a little news item about her, then I went to a chess club to meet her, and then we worked for 3 months on an op-ed that she would write.
Sure.
So that's what I'm doing for my part. Everyone else can ask, what they're doing.
Well, I don't necessarily want to blow my own horn, but in my own way, I have promoted intergroup dialogue here within the Jewish community as well, and literally brought Haredi and unaffiliated Jews together to talk about not can we all get along, but what are our principles? And if we talk about our principles, we might find the important issues that divide us. Years ago, an Orthodox rabbi came and said, I have an incredible singing group. I want to bring them here. The only thing you have to do is have men and women sit separately. I said, absolutely not, because Jewish unity is not built on the backs of Jewish women. It was not even a negotiable. And yet I understood his principle, and he understood where I was coming from. He was shocked that we had principles, right? So the idea, right. We need to do a better job of talking what our principles are, of course, but what I'm saying is that Pittsburgh is unique from other cities I've lived in insofar as that there is a cross-group dialogue within the Jewish community and beyond the Jewish community. I'd like to get personal for just a minute, and then I'd like to open it up to some questions. You do have questions, don't you? Yeah. Okay, at least this side has questions.
Susie Weiss has a question, it seems.
One of the great questions of community organizing for years was, what keeps you up at night? And the more favorite question is, what gets you up in the morning? What gets you to bounce out of bed in New York with the traffic and the noise and the things like that and say, I've got things I need to do in this world. What gets you up out of bed in the morning?
I have a few answers to that.
Please.
One is that I have the greatest job in the entire world. Like, I cannot believe that I get paid to do what I do and that I get to do it at the New York Times now. It is, like, that has not worn off for me at all, and I don't expect it to. I'm going to Israel next week with my dad to do a reporting trip for the New York Times, where we're going to go and we're going to be there during the Jerusalem mayoral election. I'm hoping to profile one of the stars of Fauda, who married the most prominent Arab broadcaster in Israel. We're going to go and tour the city of David. I'm going to write about that. That's crazy to me that I get to do that for my job, because I'd be doing it otherwise. So that's one. Two is, as I mentioned before, the opportunity to give other people the chance to promote their message by appearing in the New York Times and seeing how much that can transform a person's life or the life of a cause is absolutely mind-blowing to me. I'll give you a tiny example. My friend David Wolpe, who's a rabbi in Los Angeles,
Sinai Temple, it's a conservative synagogue,
mentioned to me he's going to be in Japan. He's speaking at the groundbreaking for a memorial statue, honoring this man Sugihara, who I had never heard of. Sugihara saved 6,000 Jews with false visas as an agent of the Japanese government, who was then punished for it. He had a sort of hard rest of his life, but he saved these 6,000 Jews and ended up, through them, saving so many more. I said, you know what, that's just like, people are dying for stories that are uplifting right now. Let's do a story about that. He published this story. It was like, went crazy in terms of numbers. And then dozens, if not hundreds of people were writing, including friends of mine, saying Sugihara saved my grandparents, and that's why I'm alive today. I mean, that is like incredible to me. And now there's filmmakers thinking about doing a movie about him, all from this one op-ed that came from a random dinner we had in Los Angeles. There are so many stories like that where I'm like, I can't believe I have the power to do that. And it's a power I take really seriously, but it's also so exciting. And as someone who loves matchmaking, I love thinking about, who's the right person to talk about this idea. It's so much fun. I'll give you a fun example, which is my first day the weekend before I started at the New York Times, Roger Ailes, who started Fox News, major Republican operative, had died. And there was a question of who would be the interesting person to write about Roger Ailes' death. And they reached out to me and said, just if you have anything in mind, because I had worked at the Journal, which is owned by, connected to the same company as Fox News. And I was like, oh my God, you know who I'd love to hear from? I'd love to hear from Monica Lewinsky. Because basically Fox News was built on the ruins of her life and of the Clinton scandal. And lo and behold, the first day I walked into the New York Times on the Monday after the weekend, I had this op-ed from Monica Lewinsky. And it was like, that's amazing. And I wouldn't necessarily, with all due respect to the Jewish Chronicle, be able to call up and say, Monica Lewinsky, you want to write for the Jewish Chronicle? The New York Times kind of gives you that power.
Sure.
And it's, someone said the other day, it's the most powerful last name in the world. I'm Bari Weiss of the New York Times. And it's something that I take seriously. And I mean, the other part of it that really sort of blows my mind, especially when reading about the history of the paper and talking to the old timers there, is how much I can be fully myself in terms of my Jewishness. I mean, I've written columns about Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur in my year there. And, they're basically like little divrei Torah that are running as op-eds in the Times. That's pretty incredible.
Yes, Rabbi Weiss.
Yes.
I read your columns and was deeply moved by them. Just a little bookend to what you were talking about Japan. Just last week I was invited by the German government to attend commemoration for the 80th anniversary of Kristallnacht in Berlin. And I've only set foot in Frankfurt Airport. Wow. Germany still has an aura about it that is challenging for me. But the government wants me and other rabbis there, specifically non-Orthodox rabbis, to be there to meet with Angela Merkel, to meet with the foreign minister, and to take part in the official 80th anniversary of the Night of Broken Glass, Kristallnacht, which is going to be commemorated November 9th.
You're going to go,
month.
right?
I was going to say no, and my wife kicked me under the table and said, they're not going to invite you to the 90th, for goodness sake. So I am going to that, and I'll be hopefully reporting on that for the Jewish Chronicle.
Love it. Love it. They rejected my columns when I was 18. I'm still bitter.
Oh, my gosh. Tell us about how you feel about being here on this pulpit, even though, we've gotten to talk about a wide range of things. And after you talk about your Judaism, and again, you even as I cannot pigeonhole you intellectually, I don't think you can be pigeonholed Judaically as well. And how is it to be here in front of your grandma and your parents and your family and
Nina Butler, who's right in the back row,
and your larger family that cares about not just you but your entire family, and to reconnect in this way, in this setting? And after that, you talk about that, then we're going to take a microphone around and get some questions answered.
Yeah, well, I'm definitely one of those Jews when you're given the survey of what kind of Jew are you? I always just check just Jewish, which I know is probably the category for bagel Jews, who only relate to their Judaism through food.
You're going to start referencing the infamous Nixon bagel.
Yeah.
Yes.
But I really feel that way. I really feel this deep historic sense of my place in the world. I was meeting with publishers for selling a book a few weeks ago, and they were very, fixated on the New York Times. I just said, listen, I'm in the New York Times now. I might not be there in a few years. I am Bari Weiss, member of the Jewish people. I'm Bari Weiss American, but I'm really Bari Weiss of the Jewish people. And that is how I think about myself moving through the world.
Sure.
And the reason for that is my parents and the kind of Jewish context that I was raised in my family, which was really... And I am more and more amazed by how rare this is as I move through the world, really from a place of love.
Sure.
I don't have a chip on my shoulder when I walk into different Jewish settings that may or may not want me there as much as other ones. I'm okay with that. I feel a very, very profound sense of rootedness in myself. And specifically being here, those two rows are always going to be the Weiss family rows. I know that there's no nameplates on them, but the greatest, I come home I make sure that I'm home for Rosh Hashanah, basically so I can sit in that row and look down, at my whole family, which is really a gift. So when I come back here, just the sense of warmth is the best, and that is what's frankly given me the courage to go out in the world and do what I do. Mm-hmm. Or the people in this room, really.
That's fantastic. We have some applause for Bari. Where's Todd Miller? Why don't you raise your hand?
I'm sorry, I'm going to cough loudly for a minute.
Cough loudly for a minute. Okay? And by the way, here's the only caveat. If you ask a question, ask a question. We've been in far too many of these forums where there's a speech, and then what do you think of that? Ask a question, please. And by the way, because we're close and we're family and we're community, say your name so Bari knows who you are.
Hi, Bari. Thank you.
Stand up.
My name is Carol Rosen. My sister lives in the South Shore of Nassau County, and I'm wondering if you're familiar with this instance and what you think of it. They mentioned to me that one of the towns in the 5 towns, which, as most of you probably know, is very Jewish, a majority of Orthodox moved in and basically destroyed the public school system. They reduced the taxes, the school taxes, because their kids were going to Orthodox schools. And I I've seen this one other place. I read in the newspaper that in New Jersey there was a town that wanted the Eruv, and the town didn't want it, and the court said, no, you have to allow it. And at first, I thought, well, they were anti-Semitic, but then I read that the reason they didn't want the Eruv is because they didn't want so many Orthodox Jews, because they were afraid of the same thing happening to their school system. And I'm wondering if you're aware of that and what you think of it.
That's a great question. I'm not aware of this specific case in the 5 towns. My sister's nodding. Maybe you do. Do you know? Okay. I don't know about that. I'm more familiar with what's happened upstate with New Square and those communities. It's not my area of expertise, but it sounds, I mean, I know where my sensibility, like my feeling is that that's not a great thing, but I don't know about the case, so I don't want to mouth off about it because I don't know. Oh, great. Recently? Okay.
Yeah, about a year ago.
There's a great This American Life about it, so I will listen to that, and then I will email you a thoughtful answer.
Your name?
Hi, my name is Anat Talmi, and I'm an Israeli living in Pittsburgh for the last 15 years.
Closer.
I'm happy to sit on your seat and get in your shoes. I just wrote a piece, a political column to the Jewish Chronicle that appeared this week, and my question to you is, how do you stay liberal and Zionist? Because I feel that recently the progressive causes are telling you either you're with us or you're a Zionist. You can be a feminist and a Zionist.
Yeah.
You can't support LGBT and be a Zionist. So how do you feel about it, and what do you do in order to reclaim those progressive causes?
I think that's a great question. That's something that I've been encountering since I was a student in college. My way of handling it is just being it. The whole problem is that too many progressives are saying, I'm willing to check my Zionism at the door in order to be part of all of these progressive movements that I care about. I think it's extremely important as progressive Zionists to just embody both and to refuse at the entrances to those tents to check that part of our identity. The problem is that too many people are being terrified into doing that. And I think a lot about actually the example of Harvey Milk, the major gay activist from, I think, the 60s, maybe the 70s, where he would tell people, you have to come out. And the reason you have to come out is you have to give other people courage to do so. You have to give the kid who's growing up in Idaho, who's terrified and 14 years old and in the closet, the courage to know that there's something better for him. I feel that way about those of us who think differently and who don't sort of fit into a political box, which is we have to come out. We have to be our holistic selves and be who we are. And sometimes that means criticizing Israel publicly. But if we are known as people that are progressive Zionists and knowing that we're doing it from a place of real criticism and not criticism for the sake of wanting to dismantle the Jewish state, I think that's really powerful. So the thing I always tell young people when I go to college campuses, and this is the main thing they want to talk about, is just refuse. Say that you are both of those things. And the more people that do that, I think that a really powerful movement can be built around that. But I agree with the problem. It's something I've been confronting for my entire adult life, and it's quite painful.
Hi, I'm Carl Kurlander. Welcome back, Barry.
Hi, Carl.
The first one I argued with when I came back from LA. Thanks. You grew up in Western Pennsylvania. It's so great to have you home in Pittsburgh, but you embrace these contradictions so well. But we're in, Mr. Rogers' neighborhood, and you've got Republicans here who are really liberal and Democrats who are really conservative socially. And Western Pennsylvania played such a big role in the election, but I frequently think it's like safari journalism, that people don't really understand Western Pennsylvania and what Pittsburgh is and what Monroeville is versus Squirrel Hill. So I just was wondering if any of that plays a role, and if you think that the Pittsburgh point of view is part of who you are and could be more articulated.
That's so nice. I've never thought about it quite that way, but that resonates with me when you're talking about liberal Republicans and conservative Democrats or gun-owning Democrats. Yeah, I think that there's this, and the media has a huge responsibility and should be called out for this, in parroting people. People are like these two-dimensional caricatures, and all of us know just from moving through the world that is just not true. And I think that the fact that those stories, it's much easier to walk into a diner in the middle of Appalachia and get a Trump quote than it is to tell the kind of more three-dimensional comprehensive stories that you're talking about.
The nuanced stories.
And the nuanced stories. Because oftentimes when you're a journalist and you're on the beat, you're like, I need that pro-Trump quote. And you're trying to meet your deadline and you want to get that voice in, and so oftentimes nuance doesn't sell in the same way. And that's a challenge for people like us.
I want to do an informal Pittsburgh poll here. How many of you are close to, either in your family or in your friendships, somebody that you have severe disagreements with politically that you actually speak to?
Oh, I love that.
This is our town.
That's amazing.
And somehow you're in relationship.
I mean, how many of them are Lou Weiss? No.
Yeah. Who's next on the questions? Betsy, please.
Hi, I'm John Schiller. I've got two questions for you. The first is, the media helped to create Donald Trump, the candidate and the president. How do you reconcile that and continue to feed that fire? And then secondly, the show Fauda. What's your view on it in terms of it being a balanced present or a somewhat balanced presentation of the Palestinian-Israeli conflict?
Let me start with Fauda first. I was very lucky to get to have dinner with the creators the other night. And listen, when I watch that show, I'm not thinking about Hasbara or politics. I'm thinking, this is an amazing show and it's better than Homeland, and I absolutely love it. And for those of you who haven't seen it, it's on Netflix. I'm an evangelist for this show. You have to go watch it. I think it is, in terms of showing the humanity of both sides. I hate using that phrase, it's so cliche, but yeah, I do think that it does some of that, and I think it's an incredible show. As for the first question, you're right that the press both had a role to play in helping make Trump, but also truly, I would say almost to a person, had absolutely no thought that he would actually become president of the United States. So that, I think for many people, was a kind of waking up moment, at least in the press, certainly inside the New York Times. The challenge now, though, is, you have a lot of people saying, why do we give Trump so much, why do we give his tweets, that's a constant criticism, so much airtime? Well, the fact is that tweets are presidential statements. They might not be the kind of presidential statements we are used to.
They're not Lincoln-esque.
They're not Lincoln-esque. But those are presidential statements. So the question becomes, this is such a singular presidency. And are we going to sort of pretend that it's not and ignore, huge things that he's doing because we don't want to give him more press time? I mean, it's an impossible situation that I'm acknowledging, but I mean, personally, I feel we need to cover the President of the United States when he tweets about, a woman having a horse face, or when he tweets about, Saudi Arabia being deserving due process and being innocent until proven guilty. I mean, the medium, we might not like the medium, but the message matters.
That's the way it functions in Saudi Arabia, right?
Right. Anyway.
Lori.
Hi, I'm Lori Moser, and welcome back. It's a pleasure to have you here.
Thank you.
I have so many questions, I don't even know where to start. But I'm glad that there are positive stories about Israel, and I'm delighted to see that when that happens, and that the bad isn't the first line. There's been some work done on that in the stories. But that said, I'm going to ask you something about Farrakhan. And I know that he spouted some really ugly things this week, and I'm curious to know why the Times didn't cover it in any shape or form, and it may be because you don't want to cover that kind of speech, but I'm curious to know.
That's a good question. First of all, I would recommend, I've been on the Farrakhan beat for a very long time. I wrote a piece called When Progressives Embrace Hate that I would love for you to read. It's about specifically about the close relationship of two leaders of the Women's March to Farrakhan, Tamika Mallory and Linda Sarsour, specifically Tamika Mallory, and the absolute inability of the left to see Farrakhan for what he is, which is a vicious anti-Semite. Did the New York Times cover it this? I don't know if I take your word for it that the Times didn't cover it this week. There's news judgment, right? It's not news that I'm not defending it one way or the other, but let's say I'm the editor and I oversee whatever beat this would fall under, maybe tech and culture, maybe anti-Semitism, I don't know, because he tweeted it, right? The thing about I'm not an anti-Semite, I'm anti-termite, right? And termites are his word for Jews. Now, Louis Farrakhan says stuff like that like every single Sunday. Like if you really follow him, as I do on Instagram and Twitter and the rest, this is not news. It broke through, this specific one, because Twitter is changing its policy about dehumanizing language, and Twitter has gone after people like Alex Jones on the right, banning them from the platform. And a lot of people made a story of this, understandably, because they were saying, Twitter, why aren't you banning Louis Farrakhan? But in terms of what Farrakhan actually said, it was no worse than what he says on any given Sunday. The real question in this case, to me, is the social media question of what are the limitations and why are certain people being banned and others aren't. And I think I saw a lot of journalists, certainly on Twitter, asking Jack Dorsey and asking the company why Louis Farrakhan hasn't been banned yet. But I agree with you about the threat he poses, but it's less the threat he poses, it's more the fact that it's normative, that people can be associated with him and that they're not called out for it, and that they get to be profiled in Vogue as feminist heroes when they go to his church on a Sunday.
Well, and the challenge, I know, you want to follow up? Yeah. You got to.
By the way, I'm not sure if it was Vogue, but it might be.
That we as women, as Zionist women,
aren't welcome.
We're not welcome by Linda Sarsour.
Yeah, so the thing I would recommend is that there is an incredible new organization called Zioness. How many people have heard of that? Okay, you've heard of it. It's this wonderful woman, Amanda, is running it, and I think from what I can see, they're doing really great things, and they are basically adopting the method that I suggested before, which is showing up in progressive spaces as Zionists and saying we have every single right to be here just as much as anyone else. So this is a constant problem. The piece I wrote about it 8 months ago is about this, and I would really recommend following this organization because the problem you're picking up on is one that a lot of us are concerned about, and I see this organization as really trying to do something about it.
The only footnote I would make about Linda Sarsour is she's been really challenging for those on the progressive left who identify as Jewish or identify as Zionist, because she's more than willing to help take care of dead Jews. In other words, repair a cemetery in St. Louis. But live Jews, who, as Yossi Klein Halevi says, we are a people, we are not just a faith, and we have the right to demand that we be taken on our terms, just the way everybody else in identity politics demands that we accept them on their terms.
Right.
The difference is our terms of being a peoplehood, a religious peoplehood, has been in place for thousands of years. So, next question. We have a chance for about two more. We're going to end about...
my name is Larry Dorlovsky. I'm actually visiting from outside Philadelphia. And I just wanted to say that you are one of the primary reasons why Trump calling the New York Times failing is one of his biggest lies.
Oh, you're so sweet. Thank
Love
you
your
so
stuff.
much.
Love your stuff.
Thank you.
Hey, Jack, I hope you heard that.
Thank you.
To continue talking about Trump, it's amazing to me how he comes up with these labels for his opponents, Pocahontas, Wacky Jackie. And I was thrilled to see Stormy Daniels respond by calling him tiny. I'm wondering what your thoughts are. We're facing a midterm election and then a presidential election after that about his opponents and whether they should respond on a street level to his comments or they should remain above the fray.
Great question. I think we saw a really, really telling trial balloon with the Elizabeth Warren Native American situation. that to me was an enormous, enormous self-own failure. Trying to play his game, he always wins at his game. He drags people into the mud. She's taking him in his word. Oh, we have this bet, it's $1 million, I'm gonna prove I'm Native American, but then guess what? You're only a tiny bit Native American. It was ridiculous. The idea that that dominated the news rather than the insane interview that Trump gave the night before on 60 Minutes with Leslie Stahl, in which she crushed him, in my view, was to me very disturbing. To me, gave me a very disturbing sense of what the Democratic strategy is. Because if the strategy is, I'm going to prove to you that I'm Native American and that this thing that you used to swipe at me, I just thought it was such a major fail. It also was a major fail to me in terms of this really interesting study that just came out. If you Google Yasha Monk Atlantic, you can read about it, although David Brooks also wrote about it in his recent column about the rich white Civil War. So anyway, there was a very interesting study which showed that 80% of Americans of every political stripe really don't like political correctness, and they really don't like the identity politics game. What that tells me is that strategy, which I see a lot happening on the left, at least on its fringes, the Julia Salazar thing we talked about before, is not a winning strategy. And I am looking for candidates who are able to, A, appeal to a lot of the people who voted for Obama and then voted for Trump, just practically, but then also are able to appeal to people without relying on the sort of the identity politics thing. I'm not sure who that will be. I will vote for anyone pretty much who's running against Donald Trump, but I hope that they choose someone who has the ability to win, because right now I see him as him versus Elizabeth Warren. I mean, he'll win, I think.
Let me put a bracket on what was just offered. Eric Holder offered a jarring take on Michelle Obama's when they go low, we go high, and Eric Holder basically rejected that. We need to go low.
And it wasn't just him. It was Hillary Clinton saying we need to confront people. I mean, this is a very, very disturbing, I don't even know what to call it, strategy, trend among Democratic leaders. What was so amazing was what Michelle Obama came out with the next day, which was absolutely rejecting that and saying that her statement is she stands by the idea of when they go low, we go high, now more than ever.
Sure.
I see Joe Biden. I'm sorry, I'm like stuck in 2020 thinking. But yeah, I think that's, I think if we want to reclaim and rebuild the kind of common language and civic culture that this president is desperately trying to destroy, we could do worse than to follow Michelle Obama's lead.
Wonderful. Art, why don't you stand up? Tell everybody who you are.
Art Goldberg. One of your colleagues, I think Bret Stephens, just wrote a column on how the Democrats are helping Trump, well, the left of the Democrats are. If you were running the campaign for the Democrats, how would you do it?
I would try and make a distinction between, so there's, again, this is where like the culture and the politics sort of blend together. If you see the left as being the people that shame a teenage girl in Utah for wearing a Chinese dress to prom because it's cultural appropriation, if you see the left as forcing an astronaut, as they just did with Scott Kelly, to apologize for quoting Churchill because Churchill's a racist, you're not going to want to vote for that party. They need to be drawing a distinction, I think, between what's happening among sort of the elitist left and who the Democrats want to represent, which is the every man and woman in America. And I would really be trying, if I was running a campaign, to be distancing myself from that kind of crap. Because the more people see that, they don't want to put people in office that they think embody those ideals.
I'm going to raise the one passionate disagreement we have as a way to know that we're capable of being dear friends.
I don't know what it's going to be.
Well, you're going to guess I'm from Minnesota, and Garrison Keillor is very dear to me.
Oh, okay.
And you hate Perry Home Companion.
I hate it.
I know, with a passion.
I do.
And I like
It's trash.
I like homespun truths and all kinds of things like that.
Get a good podcast, Jamie.
And yet, we are the dearest of friends, and I read your things avidly, and you have not only made yourself a home here at Temple Sinai. We discuss with great interest, with great concern for each other, the words that I offer from this pulpit, and we hope that this relationship continues not only here, but not only with Temple Sinai, and not only the Jewish community, but all of those whom you reach, knowing that you, as you said at the beginning, Pittsburgh made you a unique voice in the world that desperately needs to be heard. Thank you to Bari Weiss.
Thank you. Thanks, guys.